The old community hall was buzzing with the kind of nervous energy that only comes before a big performance. The air smelled thick, a heavy mix of floor wax, strong coffee, and the sweet, cloying scent of too many bouquets of flowers stuffed into vases near the entrance. It was the annual spring showcase, the night where the local music academy showed off its best students. Parents were dressed in their finest clothes, adjusting ties and smoothing out skirts, while the students ran back and forth, their instruments' cases tapping against the wooden floorboards. In the middle of all this chaos sat an elderly woman. She was perched on a folding metal chair that had been set up near the back wall, squeezed between a large potted plant and a stack of empty music stands. She looked very out of place among the expensive dresses and sharp suits. She wore a simple, faded cardigan that had seen better days, with a tiny patch on one elbow where the fabric had worn thin. Her skirt reached past her knees, and on her feet she wore thick, sensible black shoes that looked made for walking long distances rather than attending a gala. She held a clutch bag tight against her chest. Her eyes were bright, taking in every detail of the scene around her. She watched the young violinists tuning their strings with looks of intense concentration. She saw the pianists stretching their fingers, trying to shake off the nerves, but mostly she watched the people. She watched the way mothers fussed over their children's collars and the way fathers patted shoulders to offer silent encouragement. A small, gentle smile played on her lips. Though she did not say a word to anyone, despite being right in the flow of traffic, nobody seemed to notice she was there. It was as if she had become invisible, blending into the background of the busy room. A tall man in a gray suit was walking backward, gesturing wildly at someone behind him. He bumped right into her shoulder, hard enough to rock her on the chair. The woman steadied herself, waiting for an apology. She looked up at him, ready to nod and say it was all right. But the man didn't even pause. He didn't look down. He just kept talking loudly to his friend about stocks and business, moving past her as if she were nothing more than a coat rack left in the wrong spot. The woman adjusted her cardigan and sat up straight again. She didn't look angry. She just looked like someone who was used to this kind of thing. A few minutes later, a group of 3 women walked by. They were holding large, glossy programs and laughing about something one of them had said. They stopped directly in front of the elderly woman, blocking her view of the stage. They stood there for a long time, chatting about a dinner reservation they had made for later. The woman on the right shifted her purse and rested her foot on the metal rung of the elderly woman's chair, jostling her leg again. Still, they didn't turn around. They didn't see the person sitting inches away from them. To them, the chair was just empty space in a crowded hallway. The elderly woman shifted her weight, trying to find a comfortable spot on the hard metal seat. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small velvet-covered notebook. It was old, the corners rounded off from years of use. She held it for a moment, her thumb stroking the fabric cover before putting it back into her bag. She checked the clock on the wall. It was almost time. Everyone else had someone to talk to. The students clustered in groups, giggling and whispering. The parents formed their own circles, discussing their children's futures. The room was filled with noise and connection. But the woman in the cardigan sat alone in her island of silence. A young man carrying a cello case struggled to get past the crowd. He looked frustrated, his face red with exertion. He saw the gap next to the elderly woman and made a beeline for it. He didn't ask her to move. He didn't say, "Excuse me." He just turned sideways and shoved his large instrument through the narrow space between her knees and the potted plant. The hard case scraped against her leg. Catching the fabric of her skirt, she flinched and pulled her legs in tightly, pressing herself against the wall to give him room. The young man muttered something under his breath about the crowd being ridiculous, and walked away without a backward glance. She smoothed down her skirt where the case had snagged it. She didn't sigh. She didn't complain. She simply watched him go, her eyes soft. If anyone had stopped to look at her, really look at her, they might have noticed the way her hands moved. They were resting in her lap now, fingers tapping a silent rhythmic beat against her thumb. They were rough hands, with thin skin and prominent veins, but they moved with a fluid, practiced grace. They were hands that knew work, but they also knew art. An announcement came over the speaker system. static-filled voice asking everyone to take their seats in the main hall. The crowd began to surge toward the open double doors. The noise level rose as people hurried not to be late. The woman stood up slowly. Her joints popped slightly, a testament to her age. She brushed a stray piece of lint from her sleeve. She waited for the rush to subside a little. There was no reason for her to push. She had no reserved seat. She wasn't sure if she was even allowed to sit in the front section where the families were. She moved with the crowd, staying close to the wall. She was small and moved quietly like a shadow. As she entered the main hall, an usher stopped a family in front of her. "Tickets, please," the usher said cheerfully. The father held out his phone, a QR code glowing on the screen. The usher scanned it and handed them a program. The family walked in. The elderly woman stepped forward next. She reached into her pocket, but her hand came up empty. She wasn't looking for a ticket. She was just fidgeting. "I am with the maintenance team," she said softly, her voice barely rising above the noise of the crowd. "I tuned the piano earlier." The usher, a young girl chewing gum, barely looked at her. She was busy looking at the next person in line. "Oh, okay. Staff usually goes around the back, or stands in the back," she said distractedly, waving her hand vaguely toward the far wall. "Just don't block the aisle," the woman nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. She walked slowly down the side aisle. The seats were filling up fast. She found a spot in the very last row, right against the wall. It was the kind of seat where the speakers were a bit too loud and the view was partially blocked by a pillar. She sat down and arranged her bag on her lap. Around her, people were settling in. They were opening bags of candy, checking phones, whispering about who was playing first. A couple behind her were arguing about whether they had time to grab a snack. The atmosphere was excited but casual. It was just another community event for most of them. They were here to support their kids, to be seen, to pass the time. The woman sat still. She looked toward the stage. The grand piano sat there in the center of the spotlight, gleaming black and beautiful. It looked majestic. It looked like a king on a throne. She stared at it with such intensity that it seemed like she was trying to send a telepathic message to the polished wood. She knew exactly how that piano felt. She knew the touch of the keys, the resistance of the pedals, the specific smell of the dust inside it. She knew the instrument better than she knew most people. But to the couple eating candy behind her, she was just a silhouette blocking a tiny part of their view. To the usher, she was staff who should stay out of the way. To the man in the gray suit, she was an obstacle he had walked into. In a room full of people, celebrating music and talent, she was the only person who truly seemed to understand the soul of the instrument sitting on stage. Yet she was the only person who wasn't being celebrated. The lights in the hall began to dim. A hush fell over the crowd, broken only by the crinkle of candy wrappers and the last coughs of people clearing their throats. The woman took a deep breath. She placed her hand over the velvet notebook in her bag again, feeling the beat of her own heart, which was beginning to speed up. The stage lights brightened, illuminating the curtains, and the chatter finally died away completely. Everyone was looking forward, waiting for the show to begin, never realizing that the most important story of the night was sitting quietly in the back row, watching and waiting. The murmur of the crowd slowly died down as the lights in the auditorium dimmed even further. A spotlight cut through the darkness, hitting the center of the stage where a microphone stand waited. The atmosphere shifted from casual socializing to a focused anticipation. People stopped checking their phones and stopped unwrapping candies. All eyes turned to the side of the stage where the director of the music academy was walking out. The director was a tall man who always dressed sharply for these events. He wore a tailored suit and had his hair perfectly styled. He commanded respect in the town, not just because he ran the school, but because he was known as a strict disciplinarian. He walked to the microphone with a confident stride, tapped it once to check the sound, and looked out over the sea of faces. "Good evening. Ladies and gentlemen, families and friends," he began, his voice booming through the speakers. "Welcome to our annual spring showcase." A polite round of applause rippled through the room. The elderly woman in the back row clapped her hands softly together. She watched the director with a look of mild curiosity. She had seen him around the building many times, usually rushing from his office to a meeting, barking orders at the staff. He had never once spoken to her, other than to tell her to make sure she didn't scuff the floor while cleaning. "We have a wonderful program prepared for you tonight," the director continued. Smoothing his notes on the podium, "Our students have worked incredibly hard. We have violinists, cellists, and, of course, our pianists. It is a night to celebrate the future of music in our community." He paused for effect, looking around the room. "Before we begin, I would like to thank our sponsors and the parents for their endless support. Without you, none of this would be possible." The audience clapped again. A man a few rows in front of the elderly woman nodded solemnly. "Clearly pleased to be part of the support system," the director mentioned. The woman in the back row shifted in her hard seat. She wasn't bored, but she had heard this speech many times before. She knew the rhythm of these events. The speeches were usually followed by hours of watching young children play scales and simple songs. She loved the children, of course. She loved seeing their passion. But she also knew there was a difference between playing the notes and making music. The director looked down at his clipboard, frowning slightly. He shuffled a few papers, looking a bit confused. The silence in the room stretched out. The audience began to shuffle their feet, wondering why the pause was happening. The director looked up, his brow furrowed, and then looked toward the wings. The dark areas on the side of the stage where the curtains hid the backstage area. "It seems," the director said, his voice sounding a bit unsure now, "that there has been a change to the printed program." A low whisper went through the crowd. People tapped their programs, wondering if they had the wrong paper. The teenager sitting a few seats away from the elderly woman sighed loudly and checked his watch, annoyed by the delay. "We have a late edition," the director announced, clearing his throat. "A request for an opening performance. It is highly unorthodox. But I was assured it would be worth your time." The whispers grew louder. Who could possibly be added at the last minute? Was it a special guest? A famous former student who had come back to visit? The excitement in the room began to build, replacing the impatience. "She is not a student of ours," the director continued, looking at his notes again as if he couldn't quite believe what he was reading. "But she has been a dedicated member of our musical family for many years. She asked to play first, before the students, to set the tone for the evening." The elderly woman in the back row stopped breathing for a moment. She froze. Her hands, which had been resting quietly on her bag, gripped the fabric tight. She looked toward the curtain on the left side of the stage. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs so hard she could hear it in her ears. The audience, however, was confused. Dedicated member? A woman in the third row whispered to her husband, "Do they mean a teacher? I didn't see her name in the program. Maybe it's a donor," the husband replied. "They always get special treatment." The director cleared his throat again, clearly uncomfortable. He didn't like surprises. He liked order. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice firming up, "please welcome a very special performer." He stepped back from the microphone and gestured toward the side curtain. The velvet fabric moved. From the shadows stepped the elderly woman from the back row. Well, not that woman, but someone like her. The audience stared. A man in a sharp gray suit, who had bumped into the woman in the hallway earlier, leaned forward. He squinted at the stage. He recognized that cardigan. He recognized that posture. But surely it couldn't be. The woman he had knocked into like she was a piece of furniture? The woman who sat near the broom closet in the hallway? It was her. She walked slowly into the spotlight. She wasn't wearing a gown. She wasn't wearing makeup. She was wearing the same simple skirt, the same sensible shoes, and the same faded cardigan. She looked small under the bright lights, which seemed to wash out the color of her hair and emphasize the wrinkles on her face. For a moment, there was a stunned silence in the auditorium. It wasn't the silence of respect. It was the silence of shock and confusion. The whispers that had been quiet before now erupted into a loud buzz. "Is that the cleaning lady?" A voice hissed from the front row. "Who is that? Why is she up there?" "I think she works in the lobby. I saw her polishing the piano earlier. Is this a joke? Did the director put her up to this?" The mood in the room shifted instantly. The anticipation turned into skepticism, and in some corners, cruelty. People crossed their arms. The teenager rolled his eyes and slumped down in his seat, preparing to be bored or to laugh at what he expected would be a terrible performance. They didn't know her name. They didn't know her history. To them, she was just the help. Someone who should be invisible. Someone who certainly shouldn't be commanding their attention on the stage. The woman walked to the center of the stage. The grand piano loomed over her, looking enormous and imposing. It was a brand new instrument, shiny and expensive. She looked like a sparrow standing next to an eagle. The director stood off to the side, looking stiff. He hadn't actually listened to her request seriously when she had come to his office that morning. He had been busy, barely looking up from his paperwork. He had assumed she wanted to say a few words of thanks, or perhaps hand out a bouquet. He certainly didn't expect her to sit down and play. But she had been so persistent, and the head of the maintenance staff had vouched that she knew the instrument better than anyone. She reached the piano bench. It was a long black bench. She paused. She didn't look out at the crowd. If she had looked out, she would have seen the smirks. She would have seen the people checking their phones again, dismissing her before she had even touched a key. She would have seen the man in the gray suit whispering something to his wife that made them both chuckle. But she didn't see any of that. Her eyes were fixed on the piano keys. They were white and black, stark and clean. To her, they weren't just plastic and wood. They were a home. She reached out a trembling hand and touched the fallboard, the cover that went over the keys. She caressed it gently, the way a mother might touch a child's cheek. She slowly pulled out the bench. It made a scraping sound against the floorboards that echoed through the microphone. A few people giggled at the noise. The sound broke the tension, but only to make it more awkward. The woman sat down. She adjusted her skirt. She sat very close to the edge of the bench, her posture straightening dramatically. It was a strange sight to the audience. The contrast between her frail appearance and the grand setting was jarring. They waited. They expected her to fumble. They expected her to play chopsticks or Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. They were ready to exchange glances that said, well, that was a waste of time. The woman took a deep breath. The air in the auditorium was thick with judgment. She closed her eyes for a brief second, centering herself. She blocked out the hundreds of pairs of eyes staring at her. She blocked out the whispers and the rustling of programs. She forgot that she was just a cleaning lady to them. In her mind, she wasn't in an auditorium in a small town. She was back in her youth. She was in a concert hall in Vienna, or perhaps sitting in her living room 50 years ago. Playing for the love of the sound, she opened her eyes. They were clear and focused. She lifted her hands. They hovered over the keys for a heartbeat, arched and ready. The audience held its breath, but not in anticipation of beauty. They were holding their breath to see the disaster. Then her hands came down. The moment her fingers made contact with the ivory keys, the atmosphere in the room shifted. It wasn't a gentle introduction. It was a sudden, sharp declaration. The first note she struck was a low, resonant G-sharp that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and up the legs of the seats. It was a sound of impossible depth, rich and full, cutting through the stagnant air of the auditorium like a knife. Before the sound could fade, her left hand jumped in, followed instantly by her right, launching into a run of notes that sounded like a rushing river. For the first few seconds, the audience was frozen in a state of utter shock. They had prepared themselves for a clumsy, off-key rendition of a simple folk song. They had ready smiles of pity or suppressed laughs waiting in their throats. But those expressions died instantly. The man in the gray suit, who had been whispering to his wife, snapped his mouth shut. The teenager in the front row, who had been slouching with his arms crossed, suddenly sat up straight, his eyes wide. The music wasn't simple. It was complex and demanding. It was a piece by a classical master, perhaps Chopin or Rachmaninoff, filled with rapid runs and heavy chords. The elderly woman's hands, which had looked so frail and gnarled when she was holding her bag, were now transformed. They moved with a speed and agility that defied logic. Her fingers danced across the keyboard, independent and strong. striking the keys with precision that a machine would envy. The sound swelled, filling every corner of the high-ceilinged hall. The music wasn't just loud. It was heavy with emotion. It was sad and fierce at the same time. It told a story of loss and survival, of deep pain and incredible joy. It was the kind of music that didn't just let you listen. It demanded that you feel. The woman sat differently now. She wasn't hunched over like a shy old lady. Her back was straight, her posture regal. She leaned into the piano, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm. Her eyes were closed, her face a mask of intense concentration and profound peace. She wasn't in the auditorium anymore. She wasn't the cleaning lady, the invisible woman, the nobody. She was a giant. She was the master of the instrument. From the back row, where she had been sitting only moments ago, the view was different. The audience could see the side of her face. They could see a small smile playing on her lips as her hands navigated a difficult passage of music. She was in her element. This was where she belonged. The years of silence, of being ignored, of sweeping floors and tuning instruments for others, while her own talent gathered dust, were pouring out of her fingertips. The young man with the cello who had shoved her earlier was standing in the wings of the stage, watching from the side. He had been waiting for his cue to go on, but now he was frozen. His jaw had dropped. He knew music. He knew how hard that piece was. He had spent years practicing and still struggled with the technical section she was playing with such ease. He looked at her hands, then at her face, and realized he had made a terrible mistake. He had treated a master with disrespect in the front row. The little girl who was scheduled to play third was clutching her father's hand. She was scared to go on stage. The music she was hearing was so perfect, so powerful, that it made her own simple songs feel silly. But as she watched the elderly woman play, she saw the joy on the woman's face. She saw that the woman wasn't playing to impress anyone. She was playing because she loved it. The little girl stopped shaking. She realized that music wasn't about being perfect. It was about letting something out from inside. The piece continued to build. It moved from the melancholic introduction into a stormy middle section. The woman's hands were a blur. The sound grew louder, filling the room until the very air seemed to hum. The deep bass notes rumbled like thunder, while the high notes sparkled like lightning. The people in the audience forgot to breathe. They forgot who they were, why they were there, and what they thought of the old woman in the cardigan. There was no judgment anymore. There was only the music. Even the director, standing stiffly off to the side, felt a chill run down his spine. He had hired people with degrees from famous conservatories. He had hired teachers who claimed to be experts. But none of them played like this. There was a raw human quality to the sound that couldn't be taught in a school. It was the sound of a life lived. Every note carried the weight of decades. A bead of sweat rolled down the woman's temple. Her breathing became heavier, matching the effort of the performance, but she didn't miss a beat. She attacked the keys with a passion that seemed almost violent, yet remained completely under control. She was wrestling with the piano. She was winning. The skepticism that had filled the room only minutes ago had completely evaporated. The whispers had stopped. No one was looking at their phones. No one was checking their watches. The teenage boy in the front row had tears in his eyes, though he wasn't entirely sure why. The music was speaking to something deep inside him, something he didn't even know he had. It was strange how quickly the world had turned upside down. 10 minutes ago, this woman was a nuisance, an obstacle in the hallway. Now, she was the most important person in the world. The irony was lost on no one, though they were too awestruck to think about it clearly. They just sat there, mesmerized by the sound coming from the old piano. The melody softened, moving from the storm back into a gentler, more reflective mood. The woman's hands slowed down. The notes became longer, more sustained. She used the pedals with great skill, letting the notes blend together into a haunting harmony. The silence between the notes became as important as the notes themselves. It felt like she was saying goodbye to something. The man who had bumped into her earlier leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He felt a strange sense of guilt. He looked at the woman's worn clothes and sensible shoes, then at her hands flying across the keys. He realized that he judged a book by its cover in the worst possible way. He had dismissed her because she didn't look the part. He had ignored her humanity because of her job. Now she was showing him more beauty in 5 minutes than he had seen in years. As the piece neared its end, the woman's movements became even more precise. She played a series of intricate trills that sounded like birds singing, then plunged back down into the lower register for the final cadence. The entire auditorium seemed to lean forward in anticipation. They didn't want it to end. They wanted to stay in this world she had created for them, a world where talent mattered more than status, and where beauty came from the most unexpected places. With one final, decisive motion, she struck the last chord. It was a series of deep, resonating notes that rang out together, creating a wall of sound that seemed to suspend time. She held her hands on the keys, letting the sound fill the space, letting it echo off the walls and ceiling. Her shoulders dropped slightly as the tension left her body. She sat there, bathed in the spotlight, the dust motes dancing around her in the beam of light. The silence that followed was the loudest sound the room had ever heard. It was a heavy, expectant silence. No one clapped. No one moved. They just stared at the stage, stunned, their hearts beating a little faster. The old woman had stopped playing, but the music seemed to hang in the air, ghost-like and beautiful. She slowly lifted her hands from the keyboard and placed them gently in her lap. She was no longer a performer. She was just a tired old lady sitting at a piano. But the spell she had cast over the room remained unbroken. The silence that filled the auditorium was heavy, thick, and absolute. It was the kind of silence that feels physical, like a weight pressing down on everyone's shoulders. The last vibrations of the piano chord had faded into the air, but the ghost of the sound still seemed to hang above the stage. The elderly woman sat with her hands resting in her lap, her eyes fixed on the black and white keys. She was breathing deeply, her chest rising and falling slowly, coming down from the high of the performance. She did not turn around. She did not look out at the hundreds of people sitting behind her. She just waited, as if she was unsure if she was allowed to leave yet. In the audience, nobody moved. It was as if time had stopped. The man in the gray suit was still leaning forward, his mouth slightly open, his eyes glued to the stage. The teenager who had been checking his watch earlier was now sitting on the edge of his seat, his hands gripping his knees so tightly his knuckles were white. The parents who had been whispering and ignoring the woman just moments ago were now struck dumb, staring at the back of her cardigan with a mixture of awe and confusion. 5 seconds passed. Then 10. The air in the room felt charged with electricity. It was the kind of moment that happens rarely in life, where a shared experience transforms a group of individuals into a single breathing entity. They had all just witnessed something impossible. They had all made a judgment. And they had all been proven wrong in the most spectacular way possible. Then, a sound broke the spell. It was a sharp intake of breath from the back row, followed by a single loud clap. It wasn't a polite clap. It was the sound of someone who couldn't hold it in any longer. Suddenly, the room erupted. It wasn't the polite clapping that usually happens at these community events. It wasn't the applause, because we have to noise. It was a roar. It started as a wave and turned into a thunderstorm. The entire audience stood up as one person. Hands came together in a deafening rhythm. People were shouting bravo and encore. The sound was so loud it seemed to shake the dust from the rafters. The elderly woman flinched slightly at the sudden noise. She turned her head slowly, looking out over the crowd for the first time. Her eyes were wide, blinking in the bright spotlight. She looked confused, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. She saw the man in the gray suit clapping so hard his hands were red. She saw the teenage boy wiping tears from his eyes with his sleeve. She saw the director standing off to the side, clapping with a look of genuine pride on his face. She saw that they were standing for her, for years. She had walked through these halls invisible. She had cleaned the floors they walked on and tuned the instruments they played, and they had looked right through her. Now, those same faces were flushed with excitement, their eyes shining with admiration. They weren't seeing a cleaning lady anymore. They were seeing the artist. They were seeing the human being who had poured her soul into the music. The woman's face turned a shade of pink. A shy, hesitant smile touched her lips. She stood up slowly, holding onto the edge of the piano to steady herself. She walked to the front of the stage. She didn't bow like a celebrity, low and dramatic. She just nodded her head slightly, a simple gesture of thanks. She looked like a grandmother acknowledging a birthday cake, humble and sweet. This only made the crowd cheer louder. The applause intensified, becoming a rhythmic stomping of feet. The young man with the cello, still standing in the wings, was clapping with his hands high above his head. He felt a lump in his throat. He realized that he had judged her based on her age and her clothes, missing the incredible fire that burned inside her. He felt ashamed, but he also felt inspired. If she could do that, he could do better. The director walked onto the stage. The applause quieted down just a little, but people remained standing. He reached out and gently touched the woman's shoulder. He leaned in and whispered something in her ear. She shook her head quickly, putting up her hand as if to say no. But the crowd, seeing this, started chanting one more. One more. She looked at the director, then at the piano, then at the sea of expectant faces. It had been so long since she played for anyone. She had forgotten the feeling of connection, the way music could bridge the gap between souls. She realized that she wasn't just playing notes. She was speaking a language they all understood, a language of emotion and truth. She slowly walked back to the bench. The roar of the crowd died down to a murmur, then to complete silence. She sat down. She didn't open her music book this time. She didn't need it. She raised her hands and began to play again. This time, the music was different. It wasn't a stormy, complex classical piece. It was a simple, beautiful melody. It was soft and gentle, like a lullaby. It was a song that seemed to carry the memories of a lifetime, the joy of childhood, the warmth of love, the pain of loss, and the peace of acceptance. It floated through the room like a warm breeze. The audience listened in a state of trance. The simplicity of the melody made it even more powerful. It felt like she was telling them a secret. The man in the gray suit thought of his own mother. The teenage girl in the front row thought of her dreams. The director thought of why he fell in love with music in the first place. It was a human moment, stripped of ego and pretense. When she finished this second piece, she didn't wait for the applause. She stood up immediately, clutching her velvet notebook to her chest. She gave one last quick nod to the audience and turned to walk off the stage. She moved quickly, almost scurrying into the shadows of the wings, as if she was afraid if she stayed a moment longer, the magic would break as soon as she disappeared from view. The applause started up again, lasting for several minutes. But the woman was already gone. She didn't want the flowers, or the interviews, or the praise. She had done what she needed to do. She had shown them who she was. Backstage, the air was cool and dark compared to the bright heat of the stage. The woman leaned against a brick wall, letting out a long, shaky breath. Her hands were trembling, not from weakness, but from the adrenaline rushing through her veins. A young stagehand, a girl she had seen many times but never spoken to, walked by. The girl stopped. She looked at the elderly woman with wide, wonder-filled eyes. That was the most beautiful thing I ever heard, the girl whispered. She didn't ask for an autograph. She didn't treat her like a star. She treated her like a hero. The elderly woman smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that made her look years younger. "Thank you," she said softly. It was just time to let it out. She straightened her cardigan and picked up her old bag from the floor where she had left it. She walked down the long hallway toward the exit. She could hear the applause still echoing faintly from the auditorium. It was a nice sound, but she didn't need it anymore. She had proven to herself that she still had it. She had reclaimed a piece of herself that she thought was lost forever. As she pushed open the side exit door and stepped out into the cool night air, she felt lighter. She walked toward the bus stop, the sounds of the city swirling around her. The world was the same, the cars were driving by. The streetlights were humming, but she was different. She was no longer the invisible woman. She was a musician, and she knew that as long as she had the music, she would never truly be alone again. The night was not dark to her. It was filled with melodies waiting to be written. The side exit of the community hall clicked shut behind her, cutting off the roar of the applause and the bright lights of the stage. The night air was cool and crisp, a stark contrast to the stuffy, heated atmosphere of the auditorium. The street outside was quiet. Save for the distant hum of traffic and the rhythmic chirping of crickets in the small patch of garden near the sidewalk, the elderly woman walked over to the metal bench that sat near the bus stop. She sat down slowly, her body feeling the ache of the adrenaline that was now fading away. She placed her bag beside her and let out a long, shaky breath. Her hands were resting on her lap, and for the first time in hours, they were still. She looked down at them, turning them over in the pale yellow light of the street lamp. They were still the same old wrinkled hands with the swollen knuckles. They were the hands of a woman who scrubbed floors and carried heavy trays of water for the flowers. But now, they felt different to her. They felt like they had been washed clean from the inside. She sat there alone, listening to the city breathe. Inside the building, the event was likely continuing. The students would be playing their pieces. The parents would be clapping politely. The judges would be scoring their performances. But out here, there was a profound peace. She didn't feel the need to rush back in. She didn't feel the need to hear what people were saying. She knew what she had done. She had taken the silence of her life and turned it into sound. She had spoken without saying a word, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had been heard. After a few minutes, the heavy metal door of the hall opened again. A young man stepped out. It was the teenager with the cello, the one who had been waiting in the wings to perform. He still had his instrument case strapped to his back, but he wasn't walking with the arrogant, rushed stride he had earlier. He walked slowly, looking around as if he had lost something. He spotted her sitting on the bench in the shadows. He stopped for a second, perhaps surprised to see her sitting there so calmly. He hesitated, then walked over. The crunch of his shoes on the gravel path made her look up. "Hi," he said. His voice was quiet, stripped of the bossy tone he had used when he demanded her to move her legs earlier. He looked awkward, shuffling his feet. "Hello," the woman replied softly. She pulled her cardigan tighter around herself against the chill of the wind. "I saw you play," the boy stammered. He looked down at his shoes, then up at her. "I was standing backstage." The woman nodded but didn't say anything. She just watched him with patient, kind eyes. "It was amazing," the boy blurted out, the words rushing out as if he had been holding them in. "I mean, really. I've been playing for 10 years and I don't think I can make the piano sound like that. I don't think I can make anything sound like that." He looked at her hands, then back at her face. "I'm sorry," he said. "Earlier, when I bumped into you with my cello, I didn't know." The woman smiled gently. She saw a young man who was learning a lesson that wasn't written in any music book. "It is all right," she said. "You were nervous." "We are all nervous before we play." "That's the thing," the boy said, stepping a little closer. "When I play, I'm thinking about the judges. I'm thinking about winning. I'm thinking about what everyone thinks of me. But when you played, you weren't thinking about any of that, were you?" "No," the woman said. She looked up at the dark sky, where a few stars were trying to shine through the city glow. "I was just thinking about the music, and how much I missed it." The boy stood there for a moment, letting her words sink in. He shifted the weight of his cello case on his back. It felt heavier now, or perhaps he just noticed the weight more. "I guess I have a lot to learn," he said, almost to himself. "We all do," the woman said, "until the day we stop playing." Just then, the bus rounded the corner, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The brakes hissed as it pulled up to the curb. The doors folded open with a clatter. The woman stood up. She picked up her worn bag and smoothed her skirt. The boy stepped back to give her room. "Good luck," she said to him, gesturing toward his cello. "Play with your heart, not just your hands." "I will," the boy promised. He watched as she climbed the steps of the bus. She didn't look like a celebrity. She didn't look like a master. She looked like a grandmother going home after a long day. But to him, she was the biggest star in the world. The bus ride home was short. The vehicle was mostly empty, save for a few tired people coming home from late shifts. The woman sat by the window watching the city streets blur past. She thought about the faces in the audience. She thought about the silence before she played and the noise after. It felt like a lifetime ago when she got off at her stop and walked the 2 blocks to her small apartment. She felt a lightness in her step that hadn't been there for years. She climbed the stairs slowly, holding the handrail. She unlocked her door and went inside. Her apartment was simple and quiet. There was no grand piano here. There was only an old keyboard in the corner of the living room, covered by a cloth to keep the dust off. It was a cheap electric model, one that she had bought at a garage sale years ago. It didn't have the soul of the grand piano at the hall. It didn't have the deep, rich resonance. It was plastic and battery-operated. She walked over to it and pulled off the cloth. She sat down on the small bench. She turned it on, and the little red power light flickered to life. She placed her fingers on the keys. They were cold and unresponsive compared to the instrument she had played earlier, but it didn't matter. She closed her eyes and played a chord. It wasn't perfect. The sound was a bit tinny, but in her head she heard the orchestra. She heard the thundering bass and the singing high notes. She felt the power of the music surging through her veins again. She realized that the magic wasn't in the piano. It wasn't in the fancy hall, or the spotlight, or the applause. The magic was in her. It had been there all along, hiding under layers of age and invisibility, waiting for her to let it out. She had spent years thinking she was done, that her time had passed. She had let herself be ignored because she thought she had nothing left to give. But tonight, she learned that it is never too late to be seen. It is never too late to share the gift you have inside, no matter how old you are or what you look like. She didn't need their validation to know who she was. But it felt good to finally be recognized. She played a soft melody on the old keyboard, filling her small living room with music. It was a quiet ending to a loud night. She played just for herself, with no audience, no judges, and no expectations. And as the notes floated through the air, she wasn't just the cleaning lady, and she wasn't just an old woman living alone. She was a musician, and she was happy. The city outside her window kept moving, cars driving by, people rushing to their next destination. But inside that small room, there was peace. The music played on, simple and true, long after her fingers stopped moving. The song was in her heart now, and nothing could ever take that away from her again.